Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 12 of the Burgh Breakdown. I'm your host, Nick Belsky, and I hope you're as ready as I am for what could be a very fun Friday night in the city of Pittsburgh. The Steelers taking on the New York Jets in preseason action over at Acrisure Stadium, and then after that, we have a nightcap of Pirates taking on the LA Dodgers, and that's where I want to start with today's episode. Because the Pirates, after a successful homestand that we'll get to in just a few minutes, are beginning tonight what I am going to deem a season-defining road trip. We hear that quite frequently. This is the biggest series of the season. This is the biggest homestand of the season. In fact, we've heard it at least 10 times this season already. But given where the Pirates stand in the wild card story, the wild card standings, given the time of year that it is, and given the opponents they're facing, it's make or break time for the Pittsburgh Pirates. The next 9 games will be split up to 3 3-game series. First, a visit to the LA Dodgers this weekend that is going to be no easy task. Then they take on 2 teams that they are staring up at in the wild card standings in the San Diego Padres and the St. Louis Cardinals. The good thing is, while they're taking on 3 very difficult opponents on what is a very difficult road trip, the 2 teams that they're staring up at, the Padres and the Cardinals, also have difficult opponents. San Diego has to take on the Minnesota Twins and the Tampa Bay Rays. Meanwhile, the St. Louis Cardinals are taking on the red-hot Philadelphia Phillies and the all-of-a-sudden near playoff team in the Baltimore Orioles. But let's focus on the Pirates going into this stretch. They are playing much, much better baseball. In fact, they're coming off their first instance of back-to-back series wins since the All-Star break. They took 2 of 3 from a playoff team in the Boston Red Sox, and they took 2 of 3 from a Detroit Tigers team that I'm going to describe as a cooled-off hot team, because they were cooled off when they were swept by the Chicago White Sox immediately before coming into Pittsburgh. But prior to that White Sox series, the Tigers had won 4 consecutive series. So a cooled off hot team. And with those 2 opponents, not easy opponents by any means, the Pirates were able to go 4-2 on that homestand and collect their first back-to-back series wins since that pre- and post-All-Star week series, the Milwaukee sweep, and then 2 of 3 against the Guardians. And in fact, this is important for the Pirates to be able to do this and gain that momentum before this road trip that we'll talk about more, because that's also only the second time the Pirates have won back-to-back series since the end of May. The last series in May, they swept the Twins, and then they were able to take 2 of 3 from the Houston Astros. So only 2 times since the end of May had they done what they were able to do going into this road trip. So I have faith that the Pirates are going to be able to stand up to the task, and they need to, because it is going to be a huge trip for them. I mean, they're already on the outskirts of the wild card race. As we sit here today, recording this show, the Pirates are 5.5 games back of that wild card spot. You just cannot lose ground between now and the beginning of September. And that's all that remains in August, is this road trip. You cannot lose ground. So what I'm looking for from this Pittsburgh Pirates team is 6-3 or better. That should be the goal. And it's hard to go out on the road, especially against those 3 teams, and take 6 of 9 games. But there's 2 different ways that you could do it. You could either win every series, which is probably less likely, or the more realistic of the 2, considering who you're going up against this weekend in the LA Dodgers, specifically who you're going up against in their starting pitchers. I believe it's Yamamoto tonight. Tomorrow it is Tarek Skubal, and then it's Blake Snell on Sunday. That's a murderer's row. And that's just playing the Dodgers. And doing it in Dodger Stadium makes it that much tougher. So maybe you don't expect a series win this weekend, but you should be able to take at least one of three. You should be able to get out of there with at least one victory. Yeah, you want to keep the momentum going. You want to make it 3 consecutive series wins. But to me, keeping the momentum is at least getting one win here and then getting a sweep in either San Diego, which would be preferable, or St. Louis, which would be huge when it comes to the morale of the fan base. If you do decently, lose a series in LA, win a series in San Diego, but sweep the Cardinals, those next home games against the Angels, and I don't remember who else they play in that homestand, especially considering that homestand could feature the return of Connor Griffin, that'll get the fan base going, and that'll build momentum for everyone. But regardless of how you get there, I'm looking for 6-3 or better on this road trip from the Pirates. 5-4 is not a death blow. If you can have a winning record on this road trip, you can still be in a half decent position. 4-5 or worse, however, takes you into September looking at Hail Mary time. Like I said earlier, they are on the outskirts of the wild card race. If you only take 4 of the next 9 games, you're going to be praying for a Hail Mary to get back into this wild card race. And maybe that happens in the meantime. Maybe, like I mentioned, the other teams that are ahead of you in the standings are playing difficult teams. Maybe they also scuffle a little bit as well. But considering you have those head-to-head matchups with the Padres and the Cardinals, you cannot walk away from this road trip with a losing record. But like I said earlier, I have faith. I have faith in this team, not only because they built some momentum on that homestand, but because if you break it down even further, there are some areas of this team that are really starting to hit their stride. The bullpen is one of them. More than just Mason Montgomery, who has been lights out since he became the Pirates closer about 13 or 14 appearances ago. He has a sub 1.5 ERA and was terrific in that Detroit Tigers series. But the bullpen in general, since the trade deadline on August 4th, is 4th in the entire league in innings pitched. The 4th most used bullpen since the trade deadline. Ben Cherington said, hey, we revitalized it. We completely reconstructed it. And Don Kelly said, great, because we're going to use it all the frickin' time now. And to their credit, they're 11th in that time frame in ERA among relief pitchers or teams relief pitching. So they have stepped up over the past 2 weeks. O'Neal Cruz is not just back, because we had heard rumblings for the past couple weeks. Cruz is on his way. Cruz is nearing return. Cruz has started a rehab assignment. Cruz is playing back-to-back games in Altoona, which means the next step, realistically, is a return to play at the MLB level. We had the anticipation. He needed to live up to it. And so far, he has. 2 games, so a very, very small sample size. But I'm very encouraged by what I see in O'Neal Cruz. He looks to be the game wrecker that he was becoming before he got injured in June. 2 for 6 in his 2 games so far. 1 home run, 3 RBIs, and a stolen base. But it's not just the fact that he was able to pick up a hit and go 1 for 3 in each game. It's the fact that his hits were timely and in very, very big moments. In his first game back, his home run comes the half inning after Braxton Ashcraft had allowed a run. And he's only done that 2 times in his last 2 games. So to be able to pick Ashcraft up after he gives up that run, to immediately swing the momentum back into the Pirates' favor, that was massive in that game. And then again on Wednesday, first inning, the Pirates are trying to get on the board. You're starting to feel like, oh no, maybe they're going to squander this opportunity with a runner in scoring position early in this game. But O'Neal Cruz comes up, he fights off a high heater, and he sends it into the opposite field with a timely piece of professional hitting. This is the O'Neal Cruz, at least in a very small sample size, that we saw before the injury that we saw earlier this season that got everybody excited about him finally reaching that potential. The injury took that away from us in a large part. It took it away from O'Neal Cruz in a big way. But to see him, I wouldn't say pick up where he left off. It's been so long, it's hard to even bring that into the conversation. But to see him play at that level and have those timely hits is very encouraging at a very important part of this season. And the other player that you have to keep your eye on going into this road trip is Rafael Flores. 2 home runs on Wednesday, 5 in his last 7 games played. And as he showed in that game on Wednesday, not afraid of the big moment. Comes in as a pinch hitter in, I believe it was the 7th inning, and he sends an absolute bomb out to left field to make it 3-2. He comes up again in the 9th against Kenley Jansen, who, listen, I was there on Monday. Kenley Jansen carved through the Pirates in the 9th. It was quick work that he made of the Buccos. And it looked like he was about to do it again in the 9th inning on Wednesday. But Rafael Flores said, not today. And he sent one onto the rotunda in left field. We all knew that when the Pirates acquired Flores in the Bednar trade, the big reason was the offense. He was going to bring power and offense from the catching position, something that they had lacked in Henry Davis. To this point of the season, before this last stretch of 7 games played, we had yet to see it. Right now, we're starting to see it. It's not something that I'm going to say he's going to go on an Esmeralyn Valdez-like run, but he is feeling it right now. He is seeing it very well right now, and he is going to be a big piece as to whether or not the Pirates are going to be able to find some success on this road trip. I've said it multiple times on the Burgh Breakdown over the last couple weeks. The target for me going into September is be 4 games or less behind a playoff spot. They said at 5.5. I want to see over the next 9 games if they can eliminate 1.5 more games. More would be great, but I want to see them at least wipe out 1.5 games and be within 4 games of a wild card spot when September rolls around. Let's talk some Pittsburgh Steelers football. It is the day of preseason game number 2. Steelers taking on the Jets tonight at 7 p.m. from Acrisure Stadium. So figured I'd jump on here and share 3 things that I am keeping an eye on as the Steelers take on those New York Jets. First, and I wouldn't say foremost because I think we all know what the biggest storyline is. I'm going to put that in my back pocket and save it for the end of this segment. But the first thing I want to talk about here is Caleb Johnson. His back is as against the wall as it can be going into preseason week 2. Last week, he was 4th among Steelers running backs in carries, and that's with Jaylen Warren and Rico Dowdle not even suiting up. He finished with 2 carries for 3 yards in the preseason opener against the Green Bay Packers. Now, as of right now, if you look at the depth chart on Steelers.com, Caleb Johnson is running back 3. But I think anybody who's paying attention knows that Travis Homer and maybe even Lou Nichols is ahead of him in the eyes of the coaching staff. You can tell based on the opportunity they've gotten. You can tell based on the performances they've had. You can just tell based on common knowledge that Caleb Johnson is pretty much in a make or break dire situation going into preseason game number 2. In fact, you look at Eli Heidenreich, and it feels like he has more buzz behind him than Caleb Johnson. And we're talking about a guy who was a 3rd-round pick last season. It's a huge game tonight for Caleb Johnson, a guy who, maybe just doesn't fit the Mike McCarthy scheme, but a guy who still had pedigree coming out of college, a guy who the Steelers believed in a big way going into last season. And while he might have squandered it last season, you thought maybe with a new head coach, a new regime starting in Pittsburgh, it could be a fresh start for Caleb Johnson. So far, it's continued to go in a negative direction for him. So it is a big, big game for Johnson tonight. How's he going to respond? What opportunities is he going to get, first of all? And in those opportunities, how will he respond? Because, like I said last week, Travis Homer was out there early. Lou Nichols was out there before Caleb Johnson. And then Eli Heidenreich was in there late in the game, splitting carries seemingly with Caleb Johnson. So what do we see this week from the Steelers' 2025 third-round pick? Do we see him fight back? Do we see him step up and breathe new life into his situation? Or do we see a repeat of preseason week number 1 and essentially the nail in the coffin of Caleb Johnson with the Pittsburgh Steelers, at least with his chances of making the 53-man roster? Who knows? Maybe they can stash him on their practice squad. Maybe another team snatches him up. But this feels like do or die time for making the roster this season for Caleb Johnson. Somebody who is not in danger of losing a roster spot, but could have potentially been in danger of losing a starting spot if not for some injuries, is Dylan Cook. He did not have a stellar debut last week. And this isn't a guy, I continue to say this isn't a guy that's coming into this season as the incumbent starter that has a wealth of experience behind him. He started 4 games last year and played well in those 4 games. Now he switches from left tackle to right tackle, and the first thing we see is him give up a sack early in that game. The rest of the game wasn't horrendous, but he also wasn't playing at a very high level either. It was right down the middle. Now, here's the thing. The competition around him has faded. And a large reason for that is the injury to Maxi Honachor, who appears like he's going to miss a second consecutive game. Before that injury happened to Honachor, he was coming on strong. And in fact, we had Noah Strackbine of All Steelers Talk on the show last week who said, man, Honachor right now, probably 50-50. If he performs in preseason, there's a chance that the Steelers' 2026 first-round pick would have been, or could have been, the week 1 starter when the Steelers take on the Atlanta Falcons. This injury has essentially ended any chance of that. Not that Honachor won't be the starter by the end of the season, but due to these injuries, it's unlikely that we see him as the starter at the beginning of the season. And then there's Broderick Jones, who hasn't had a bad camp, who didn't have that bad of a performance in week number 1, but somebody who probably still needs some time coming off of that neck injury before he becomes a starting offensive lineman at the NFL level. So I'm keeping a very close eye on Dylan Cook because we all know for the Pittsburgh Steelers in 2026, the offensive line is key. And the last thing you want is your starting right tackle to be a weakness heading into the very first week of the season because the competition evaporated in training camp. So I hope Dylan Cook steps up and has a better second week, if for no other reason than to keep the young quarterbacks clean and healthy, but for the sake of the veteran quarterback who will be taking snaps in about 3.5 weeks when the Steelers take on the Falcons. I briefly mentioned young quarterbacks, and that to me is the story of this game. In fact, it's been the story of this preseason. Yeah, we've talked a little bit about the offensive line. We've talked a little bit about Roman Wilson and his surprise emergence again as a training camp standout. We've talked about Bernard. We've talked about Robert Spears-Jennings on the other side. We've talked about Dalen Everett on the other side as a rookie standout. But the story of this camp is the story of the 2 young quarterbacks. And we heard a little bit of news earlier this weekend, are getting ready to watch a game that is going to feature only 2 very young, promising quarterbacks. No Mason Rudolph, no Aaron Rodgers. Will Howard is your starting quarterback tonight, and Drew Aller will follow up. Last week, Aller and Howard combined to go 17 of 22, 239 pass yards, 2 passing touchdowns, and 0 interceptions. They led 4 touchdown drives on 6 total drives, discounting the kneel downs at the very end of this game. Yes, I'm very excited to see how Drew Aller follows up what he did last week because he stole headlines, not just in Pittsburgh, but nationally. Drew Aller was the story after last Thursday night's game, if I'm getting my days correct. But Will Howard's the guy going into this game that has all the pressure on him. Not only is it because he's the one taking on ones, he's the one going up against, we'll see who all plays, but presumably going up against a NFL level, starting level defense, at least some portion of it, in the New York Jets. Not only that, a lot of the comments made this week make it seem like this coaching staff is getting quite bullish when it comes to Mason Rudolph and his spot within the organization. After last week, a lot of people, and I was watching the game with family, and the conversation at that table was, I don't think they need Mason Rudolph. Why would they need Mason Rudolph? This is confirmation that you don't need Mason Rudolph. And while I do think some of it is premature because it's preseason week 1, it's the beginning of a narrative that can continue to carry over through this week, into next week, and into that preseason finale against the Buffalo Bills. Can Will Howard carry that torch? Because really, he's the only one on the chopping block. He's the only one of the two youngins that could be cut before this season. I don't think anybody wants to see that. I think people would rather see them carry 4 quarterbacks than cut Will Howard, and I would tend to agree. But you cannot give this coaching staff, if you're Will Howard, a reason to go with the safe pick. You have to continue to force the envelope. You have to make them make that tough decision if they're only going to keep 3. Because like I said, they could keep 4, presumably. They could have Will Howard as the number 3. They could have Drew Aller as the de facto red shirt and yet still on the 53-man roster. But what we all want to see is Will Howard force the Steelers, if they're not comfortable with keeping 4 quarterbacks, to make a decision on Mason Rudolph. And that is the thing that is going to catch my attention. Yeah, I'm still going to watch Drew Aller because he was a 3rd-round pick this year. He lit the world on fire last week. Let's see if he can do it again. But the one who has pressure is the guy that's going to be your starting quarterback tonight in Will Howard. So I'm going to keep a close eye on a lot of things, but those 3 things in particular. Caleb Johnson with his back against the wall. Dylan Cook, who right now appears to be the only option for the Steelers in week 1 at right tackle. Can he find some footing? And of course, the 2 quarterbacks who are going to be a lot of fun to watch. Closing out this episode with a little Pittsburgh Penguins talk, and specifically a little 4th line talk, because not enough people talk about the 4th line, at least not in Pittsburgh. The Penguins in general surprised a lot of people last season, and everybody credited different factions of the organization for it. Kyle Dubas got a lot of credit. Dan Muse received a lot of praise. Erik Karlsson, for good reason, received a lot of praise as well. Ben Kindle as an 18-year-old. A lot of people highlighted the special teams. And in fact, all of those are correct answers when you're asking why did the Penguins perform so well in the 2025-26 season. If you said any of those, you'd be correct. But you also need to mention the performance of the Penguins' 4th line. They played a major role in this team being what they were last season, in this team getting back into the playoffs for the first time in 4 seasons. That 4th line, no matter who was on it, whether it was when Lizotte was out with injury, or Dewar was out with injury, or Achari was out with injury, usually one of those 3 were there, and they made sure whoever was filling in understood the role. If you're on the 4th line for the Pittsburgh Penguins, you're playing with high energy, you're playing smart hockey, and yeah, you need to chip in offensively. And that's what the 4th line of the Penguins did last year, especially when it comes to Blake Lizotte and Connor Dewar. My favorite stat And I believe, it was talked about on Sportsnet Pittsburgh during the broadcasts. We talked about it on Tip of the Iceberg, the other show that I do that's exclusively about the Pittsburgh Penguins. The Penguins' record with and without Blake Lizotte. With Blake Lizotte last year, the Penguins were 31, 12, and 12. Without Blake Lizotte, they were 10, 13, and 4. And you can tell, that's the only thing you need to talk about to understand how important Blake Lizotte was to the team last year and will continue to be going forward. Meanwhile, Connor Dewar played in a bevy of different roles. He stepped in at center when Blake Lizotte went down with injury. Dewar finished offensively with career highs in goals with 14 and points with 30. Both of them had stellar seasons, not just for a fourth liner, not stellar seasons for a fourth liner. They had tremendous seasons, point blank, end of story. And they were compensated for it. Both signed contract extensions. Lizotte's was before the season ended. Connor Dewar's was shortly after the season ended. But both are going to play major roles this season as well. Mainly on the penalty kill, obviously. They are the two top penalty killing forwards heading into this season. It's not particularly close, especially after Nola Chari departed for Philadelphia. That's a huge hole to fill. Connor Dewar was already number one on the team as far as ice time, shorthanded for forwards. Blake Lizotte was third. Nola Chari was second. You're going to have to fill that role, and I think part of that is going to be other people stepping up into that role, but a lot of the pressure is going to fall on the shoulders of Dewar and Lizotte to repeat what they did last year in helping the Penguins have a top 10 penalty kill in the entire National Hockey League. And then there's even strength. Yeah, Blake Lizotte's your fourth line center. Connor Dewar can play center, but he's going to be predominantly your fourth line winger. Who's on the other side? Lizotte, Dewar, Achari was a nice trio last year whenever they were healthy and together. But who's going to start the year next to those guys when the puck drops in Philadelphia in about a month and a week? Elmer Soderblom, potentially. At the end of last season, whenever there were injuries to Lizotte and injuries to Connor Dewar, Elmer Soderblom is the one that stepped up and played at a very high level and did everything that we talked about earlier when it comes to what is demanded by Dan Muse of his fourth line. You play with high energy, you play smart hockey, and you play with an offensive touch. Elmer Soderblom had 5 goals after coming over to the Penguins at the trade deadline. He had less than 5 goals in the previous 75% of the season that he had played with the Detroit Red Wings. He brings obvious size. He's not much of a penalty killer. Not really going to give you much in that aspect. But he's big. He plays the game well. He plays the game intelligently. And he has an offensive touch. So that's one option. Other options, Justin Brazeau, who had a career year as well, started off red hot, then scuffled due to some injuries and the fact that other people had stepped up and changed the structure of the Penguins' forward system, which is why Justin Brazeau found himself on the outside looking in of being on a line with Evgeny Malkin later in the season, where he found so much success earlier. He had to morph in his role from being a second-line player with high-end talent to being a third or fourth-line player with younger guys who are still trying to establish themselves. But he goes into this season. Where does he fit in? Could this be a spot for Justin Brazeau, who, again, showed some of that offensive upside, brings some size, used it a lot better last year than I feel like he did in previous stops at the NHL level, and was a good piece for them. And then there's Avery Hayes, who I think is the wild card going into this training camp. Is Avery Hayes a guy that's going to make the team out of camp? Possibly. Is Avery Hayes going to be a guy who is looked at as the first call-up? Possibly. Is Avery Hayes a guy that could be on the second line out of camp? Possibly. He could go in a multitude of different directions once training camp starts. But I wouldn't hate to see him play with Connor Dewar and Blake Lizotte. If you've watched Avery Hayes play, you'll know that he kind of fits the mold a water bug, quick around the ice, plays physical, plays bigger than he is, that could be a perfect spot for him. I don't know if you worry about having three guys that are too similar, or maybe it's like a Conehead situation from Miracle on Ice. They're a hive mind and they just play the game like poetry in motion. So I'm really intrigued to see who Dan Muse gives the nod to first when it comes to his fourth line. But the two guys, the incumbents that are going to be there, Blake Lizotte and Connor Dewar, there's a lot of pressure on them to repeat their success from last year, because the Penguins, if they want to be a playoff team again, are going to need it. But that's going to do it for this episode of the Burgh Breakdown. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this one. Remember, you can find us on YouTube at Nick Belsky, or you can catch us by searching Burgh Breakdown on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. But that's it for this one. We'll see you guys next time.